We're at Vout-O-Reenees for my exhibition called Awakenings. It's a series of paintings which go back perhaps 3-4 years, all principally inspired by the landscapes which I've experienced and sort of walked through. So the principal focus is the stones of Avebury, and these have always been a fascination for me, and most recently it jogged my mind that they had a bit more poignance and sort of relevance in the world we're in right now. I like the way that they stand and they're isolated in these fields, and this just strong physicality they've had, which has clearly been there for a long, long time. But this, what you get are these great characters and characteristics of the stones which reveal themselves just in different lights. So this one we begin with, and this is called Sentinel, that's what they're called, Sentinel. And we have slightly smaller ones, studies which I really begin with, these black and white ink drawings here, which form the basis of the studies for these larger ones. The larger paintings really use and draw on influences of sort of old archival photographs as well as my own drawings. The next one we come to is called Lovelock. Lovelock, again, what you have is, I love this idea that these things, the permanence of these things, and then what I've discovered within this are these wonderful features which somewhat ghostly and haunting looking. But again, they only give themselves and reveal themselves in these very distinct certain lights and times of day, and in these seasons. So, you might be waiting years until you get the certain light right which casts along these faces. And I'm sure people were aware of this when they were sort of assembled a long, long time ago. Move across to some 4 smaller works here, which are one sort of a bit more local to where my studio is based in Llanfairpwll in mid-Wales. Again, they explore the idea of stones and these Neolithic structures. We're never quite sure what they really are, but I just like this idea that they just can occupy the imagination. And again, they are very distinct presences, just because of their character, I think, is what really gets my attention, and the way you can inhabit them with your imagination. We have one here called Mystic Circle. This is really about this idea of how spaces have been used and deployed over the years, and this charged physical, this idea that something would have happened in a vacant spot. There's a stone circle surrounding this. It could be anywhere, but it's just this idea. I think I picked this one out from an old sort of Victorian photograph. And people would have been drawn to these places and want to know what goes on, and they still do. And this idea that we can go back into a landscape and just be always interested and curious about what happened in this void. There's a void that interests me. A painting here called Red Barn. Red Barn is a place based in East Anglia on the coastline. I've done quite a bit of work in East Anglia, and over the years I've returned to it. And this particular piece was made on a ripped off piece of sign which I felt very impulsively needed to make this painting. And I like the idea of it as these bastions you go out to sea. The whole coastline of that part of the world is sort of drawing away. And there are these pinpoint markers which give the coastline a punch. And for me, this Red Barn had enough mystery about it, which gave that idea some strength. I've always worked with poets, and in this exhibition there are 2 collections of works with poets. This particular series is based on a collaboration I did with Oliver James Lomax entitled 18 Poems. It was a publication that came out a couple of years ago. They really focus on and draw inspiration from Oliver's words. Oliver has got a great touch, witty touch, but he's also able to take you back really through his generations of his family. And I like the way he goes into this inheritance, as well as cultural inheritance, but also literal one of something being handed down to the generations. So they allowed me really to interpret these words very, very loosely, and I'm glad he felt also vigorously aligned with the text, which is important. I decided to include 2 recent works from a series called Love Scenes. These are paintings inspired by famous love stories down the ages. Again, we never know what these people look like, but what we can do is the stories are always in our popular culture, and they come back time and time and time again. but we're always left with this lingering idea of what these people might have looked like. And I think as a painter you can interpret them. It's one of the great things that you can do as a painter. You can do with great authority. You can convince people of appearances just by spurring some imaginative sort of cognition with it. This painting here is called Spirit Awakening, and it's the area as you approach Avebury where there are these barrows which go beneath, surround it. And I like the way in which you can be walking in a landscape and suddenly you encroach upon this man-made, enclosed sort of spirit world. Similar to that is this one here, which also, a larger version, slightly more, treating the slightly more broader sense. I've made a much more of a focus on this physical surge of the ground here, which drew my attention to it, but also leads the eye into this other boundary, and I just, again, it's this idea of division and boundary. Similarly, within this space you have these other stones. This one's called Heartstone, and it's an image again that carries on from these Avebury stones. They're portraits, really. They have these different features. They have a great physicality, but there's also this rich surface quality which you can never hope to copy in a painting. But I mean, what you can do is it leads you down an avenue. You want to look at the surface and you want to explore this patination, and all of that conjures up feeling and sensibility. So it's not just the craft of laying the paint down. You have to be an alchemist when you're dealing with this sort of stuff. And not to say you can do that in paint, but what you can do is you can hint at it. That's what these attempt to do in these stones. We move on over this side of the room to another series I did with a poet, Robert Minhinnick. He lives and comes from a part of the world where I grew up, and has a great affinity with this landscape, the Merthyr Mawr sand dunes. And again, these were for a collection called The Dunes, which were a series of poems inspired by the landscape. I interpreted these poems, and similarly, Robert would have seen my images. And I like to think there was this bounce back and interplay between the two of us of how we experienced the place. Robert alerted me to things like the flora and the fauna, which totally went past me by. But what I had was this idea of roving through this landscape, and they're covered in sand, and I just was really intoxicated with this idea of what's beneath your feet here, what is going on. And Robert somehow, as all good writers do and poets do, is they give you that breathing space and let you in. They sort of open up the imagination, they open up a few doors for you. We move on into a painting called Newton's Disciples. It's one of the few paintings ever made from Cambridge, a visit to Cambridge, where I went to the site where Newton's original tree was supposedly planted. And now you get these tourists who go along and get the selfies. Love the fact that a tree, or even the sapling of the original tree still creates this connection with an idea of what gravity might be. Trees always a big focus of my work. I always go back to them. Similar with the Newton's tree there. These are the only trees, really, portraits of trees in the exhibition. This is the Pontfadog oak, and it's based on, again, this physical idea of how a tree can occupy a landscape. Seems to collect these sort of natural anecdotes down the years, and if you stand around long enough, I think you can absorb them in a funny way. This is a painting based on Silbury Hill, and it's called Nature's Battery. Silbury Hill is widely regarded as being the centre, the nuclei really, of all of the ley lines that intersect through Britain. A man-made structure. No one quite knows what it's made of, when it was made, but I like this vagueness in the landscape, but this absolute physicality of something which embeds the spirit world, or the realm of an energy which we can't quite see with the tangible real world. This painting is called Lost Traces, and it was really about me on the hunt in a sort of roundabout way for this location of where Merlin could have once lived, if he indeed did live. And there is little written about, but there are a couple of suggestions of where this might have taken place. And there was one thing which drew me to this picture, or the idea of this picture was that Merlin, there was this little anecdote which suggested that he had this enclave, this space on the top of the hill. very recently they dug up this particular spot, an archaeological dig, and they did find that there was a remnants of a sort of man-made earthworks where it looked like there would have been some conference taking place there. So Lost Traces is really about how the landscape has got these things going on which really are beneath the ground and also beneath our idea of what the real world is. So we'll end with a painting here called Skellig Rising, and it's over the years I've been drawn to Ireland. My grandfather comes from Ireland. I've always had a sort of sense that I'd visit one day and make work from it, and I'm beginning to. So this is of the Skelligs, a really truly fascinating landscape, one of the most haunting places I've seen in my life. When you arrive at it, it's this enormous rock castle, cathedral-like rock coming out of the Atlantic, farthest point of the Atlantic off of Ireland. And to think that in the 4th century these monks would go out to it on a leather boat in search of getting closer to God. So that spurred that image on, and perhaps is the conduit really to my next work with landscape.